Probably the most charming man that I've ever known. But he had great vivacity, he was very well informed, and of course, brilliantly read.
His lips were thin, bloodless. His mouth always looked as dry as a bone.
He thought that money was to spend, and he did spend it.
Hi, I'm Ken DeRosier, and welcome to Instagators. This is our inaugural show. We have a very special guest today. But before that, I want to say hi to my main man, Bull, producer, director extraordinaire. How you doing today, Bull?
Doing great. We got a new setup. I'm loving it. It's looking great. Feeling great. Sounding great. All the above.
First class all the way.
Agreed.
You ready for our guest today?
I am. Very illustrious guest. Guest number
one.
He's
one of those flyers, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, without any further ado, let us meet him. Mr. Mike Nolan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ken.
I understand you used to fly.
I did. Used to. Way back.
What was the most favorite plane you have ever flown in your life?
I think, to any extent, it was the P3 Orion.
It's the one you've got the most hours in.
Back in the 1960s. I went through the sound barrier in another aircraft earlier, but that was when I was a midshipman out over the Gulf of Mexico in a dive. Nothing that was a supersonic aircraft.
But you made it supersonic.
But I was in the front seat. The instructor in the back seat made it supersonic as we took a dive from 30,000 feet.
What kind of plane was that?
That was a Cougar, an F-8. Actually, it was a Tougar, the two-passenger version of the Cougar, which was slightly faster than the single-passenger.
So the trainer version was a little bit faster?
That is correct.
Did it have a bigger engine?
But that was back when I was a midshipman on my amphibious aviation summer in Corpus Christi, Texas. But that was the only time that I've gone supersonic. I never flew in the Concorde, and I never flew in a supersonic jet.
Wow. You've got an incredible background. It all started in Wisconsin, OshKosh, Wisconsin, where the big-time aviation show is.
It is indeed. The Airventure 2019 this year. It is the 50th year that the Experimental Aircraft Association is having its convention fly-in at OshKosh, Wisconsin, Whitman Regional Airport.
And I understand you went to the first one, too.
I did.
Way back when?
Way back in 1970.
Wow.
How many people were at that one?
That was... I went to the 1970, the 1971, the 1972, and the 1973.
Was the first one crowded, or people didn't know about it then?
Oh, no, people knew about it because the EAA had been having their annual fly-ins near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in an area called Hales Corners for years before that, about 15 years. And the association had gotten much too big to be doing their convention at Hales Corners, and they were looking for a location where they would have a good airport and a lot of space for people landing. And
this is the P3 Orion. And you flew this from what years?
In the 1964, 65, 66, in the 1960s.
And they're still flown today?
Yes.
This country still flies it, the U.S. Navy. They're phasing them out, and other countries love to have it. It is an incredible plane.
Allied countries flying I think on the neighborhood of 150 of them yet.
Wow. I saw a documentary. Those of you that know me know I'm pretty much addicted to the History Channel. They had a documentary on hurricanes, and they fly the P3 Orion into the eye of the hurricane without modifying it. It is such a well-built plane. It can be flown directly in the eye of a hurricane. Isn't that incredible?
Wow.
That particular aircraft encountered G-forces of 6.5.
Wow.
And 6.5 was far beyond the book prescribed limits of that particular aircraft, although we could fly a 70-degree angle of bank in level flight 100 feet off the ocean.
So take us on a mission. You were based mostly, was it in Maryland?
At Patuxent River, Maryland.
All right, we're at
Naval Air
Patuxent River,
Station.
Maryland, and what happens?
Well, our operational flying was out over the North Atlantic Ocean. And during the summer times, we flew out from Iceland up over the North Sea, checking on the USSR fleet exercises.
How long was a typical patrol? How many hours?
The patrol flights typically were 12-hour flights.
Wow.
And so we had 3 pilots, sometimes a 4th. And
Would that be the 12th member of the crew if there was a 4th pilot?
There were 3 or 4 pilots.
Mm-hmm.
But then we had flight officers and we had enlisted personnel. And we flew back in those days as the 4-engine turboprop. We flew with a pilot in command was in the left seat. The right seat was the co-pilot on any given flight at any given time. And then the third pilot might be the navigator. And on long flights, we sometimes had a 4th pilot along, but the person doing the navigating would go from navigator to the right seat, and the person from the right seat would move to the left seat, and the person from the left seat would either move back to navigator, or if we had 4, might go on rest for a period.
And your primary mission was what, to put buoys in the ocean and just listen?
It was anti-submarine patrol, and there was a lot more to it than just listening, but I don't know, much of what I was dealing with back then is classified, and I don't know whether some of the things have been declassified. And so
Well, what would be something that is still highly classified that you would end up going to jail telling us?
That's what I don't know, and that's what
no comment.
Discuss.
Not the first time I've heard that.
I can tell you about a couple things that were classified back then that are no longer classified.
I can compromise with that.
And one was what's called Julie. That was the classified name for it. And that was something where we would drop sonobuoys. Sonobuoys were on numerous channels. And the tactical coordinator, or the TC, on the aircraft was what was originally called a naval aviation officer, NAO, and that became a Navy flight officer, NFO. And then later, they could be the commander, the mission commander. But back when I was flying, the mission commander was always the commanding officer, the senior officer on the aircraft. So he was the patrol plane commander. And I say he because back in my day, it was all men.
When did women first start flying in the Navy? I know they went all the way back to World War II. They would ferry the planes to the front lines. But when did they actually become combat? Do you know offhand?
I don't know offhand. They originally were flying in a number of non-operational commands, flying transport aircraft, that sort of thing. But even when I was going through the training command, we had no women. That was back in 1962-63. I got my wings on the 8th of August of 1963. I was in the RAG, retraining air group for the P3 at the time President Kennedy was assassinated.
How did you find out about the assassination?
I was in ground school, got an announcement that they had just heard on the news that the president had been shot and he was being taken to the hospital.
What was the reaction? Did people think this could be World War III, or what was going on?
My reaction, or I don't think any in our group, but we were certainly stunned by the announcement.
Mm-hmm.
And we discussed it at the time, and then we later heard that he had been pronounced dead at the hospital.
Yeah.
Devastating. I went to his funeral.
Wow. Oh, you were in Maryland, too. It was close by. Yeah, they say that's when the country lost its innocence. So you were trying to keep the Cold War from getting hot, and you were doing that by keeping track of these Russian subs. Were most of the Russian subs, you hear this Typhoon class, was that their most popular sub?
I don't recall. I recall the various submarines. They had a lot of what was back then called conventional submarines, and they were diesel electric. They had to snorkel, and then they, as we, had some nuclear submarines as well. And ordinarily, a nuclear submarine would just stay submerged for its mission. And checking on the Russian fleet exercises in the North Atlantic, out in the Norwegian Sea, was not looking at the submarines doing things on the surface. They were working with their surface ships. And we had similar exercises that we did with our surface ships working with our submarines.
How proficient were the Russian crews, and how well built were their subs?
I don't have any expertise in that, but I know that one of our crews, not my crew, but another crew, was sent out on a practice launch for a rescue mission, and they were simulating an aircraft having crashed at a certain point, given coordinates of where this aircraft had gone down. And I don't recall that it was a military aircraft. It was a large aircraft, and we were to get out to that point as fast as possible and report back and get a ship headed that way. And they were doing all this exercise at the same time. They went out. They were not using radar because there was nothing to see there. It was just a practice exercise. Lo and behold, just about at the point where they were going down those coordinates, there was a USSR submarine, a nuclear submarine, on the surface. And they had not detected the P3 coming in because the P3 didn't have its radar operational. And so they took pictures of the nuclear submarine on the surface, and unlike the conventional submarines that could be underwater in about 2 minutes, the nuclear submarines would take about 7 minutes to submerge.
Well,
That they
3.5
had the
times.
sailplane that was up on the what they called the sail, the top part of the
conning tower?
including the conning tower. But our squadron aircraft maneuvered around them, and they reported back and took pictures. And then there's...
What kind of sub was it? Was it one of these Typhoon classes that you see?
I don't recall. But...
were the Typhoon classes, were those the ones with the double hull?
I don't recall. I have never seen on the surface, except in port and pictures and so forth, I never saw on the surface a Russian nuclear submarine. But in our squadron that day, when they took those pictures, there was a Russian Bear bomber aircraft, which they're still flying today. There's the ones that have the two propellers on
the
each
counter-rotating
engine,
props.
The counter-rotating
Yeah.
propellers.
I always thought that was interesting.
And the Russian Bear was sent out to watch the P3, and they sent we launched a jet, and it might have been either an F-105 or an F-4 Phantom, and the jet took pictures of their Bear aircraft, and our commanding officer had pictures of their Bear aircraft and of the Russian submarine, nuclear submarine, in his office. And the pictures of the Bear aircraft showed in the turrets photographers taking pictures of the fighter aircraft, so the Russian commanding officer probably had comparable pictures of the P3 and of the 105 or Phantom, whichever it was that did the intercept on the Bear.
What would be like
That's
a
funny.
typical week for you? How many missions would you go on?
If we were flying from Patuxent River, Maryland, we might have 2 operational missions in the course of a week. We also had a squadron, and different squadrons would do it. We had a 1-hour alert and a 2-hour standby. And the 1-hour alert meant you had to be briefed and in the air within 1 hour of the time you were notified of the mission. The 2-hour standby was the backup crew that became the 1-hour crew when the 1-hour crew was launched. And that was not something that my squadron, which was VP-8, Patrol Squadron 8, did all of the time. We had VP-44 that actually shared a hangar with us at Patuxent River, Maryland. There's VP-49 that was also at Patuxent River, Maryland. And other squadrons down in Jacksonville and up in Brunswick.
What got you interested in aviation? How'd you end up being a pilot?
Well, I've had an interest in aviation from very early days. As a matter of fact, Whitman Regional Airport is named after S.J. Whitman, often called either Whit or Steve. His name actually was Sylvester John Whitman, and he was the original flying professor. He was a race pilot, flew the Formula One race aircraft, which he made himself, and he was also the designer and builder of Whitby and the Tailwind.
And that got you
built.
interested? Were you one of his students? Or?
I was not. My brother was his actual last student until he trained his young wife. When his first wife died, he married a woman who was about 45 years old, and he was about 80 at the time. And he trained her, and she became a certified private pilot. And they had aircraft that they flew between Ocala, Florida, and OshKosh, Wisconsin. They called the O&O, OshKosh and Ocala.
Makes
and
sense.
they had homes adjacent to the airport at both locations with their own hangars.
How far were the airports apart?
About 800 miles.
Wow. What's the first time you were up in an airplane?
Not until I was 14 years old. And that was the DC-3, the old Goody Bird.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a commercial flight between OshKosh and Chicago. But back when I was 8 years old, I was taxied around the airport at OshKosh, Wisconsin, which was not yet named Whitman Regional Airport, and they had scheduled service out of there, and Air Wisconsin was one of the carriers that later became Air Midwest. And the aircraft that I was taxied around in, my brother and I were in the nose gunner position of General Spaatz' B-17. General Spaatz, S-P-A-A-T-Z, was the first commandant of the Air Force. He had been commandant of the Army Air Corps, and it was his B-17, and his wingman, who was a colonel flying a B-25, flew out to OshKosh, Wisconsin. There he is.
Carl Sparks.
With the B-17, my brother and I were taxied around, but he flew out flying my grandfather, who was congressman and a good friend of his, home to OshKosh, Wisconsin, before my grandfather retired from Congress.
What's the most interesting mission you've ever been on?
Have to think of that, because there are flights and then there are missions. And
What's the most interesting thing aviation-wise you've ever come across? Have you ever come across a UFO?
Ooh.
That'd
be funny if the feed just cut out right now.
If I did, I didn't identify it. We saw things, but nothing that I recall having categorized as a UFO. There were, for example, up in Iceland in October, we saw the Northern Lights up there. And the Northern Lights, if you've ever seen them from far north as Iceland.
Well, you saw them in elevation. Looked how high?
Well, latitude.
Yeah.
And they looked like a fireworks display. Phenomenal. Like there's a bombing going on up there towards the North Pole, and all the lights and everything, but absolutely silent. You're listening for all the fireworks and everything, but there isn't any noise whatever. So that's a completely different from a mission, but an experience that I had up in Iceland.
Ever have any experiences with a USO? Unidentified submerged object, USO. I tell you, I'm addicted to the History Channel.
This is the Uniform Service Office? USO?
No, USO is unidentified submerged object. There's a famous one in Canada. I forget where that is, but both Coast Guards of both countries chased it, and was a genuine USO.
We had a number of those.
I'm sorry?
We had a number of those that we would attempt to identify. We had the capability from the P3 to locate, track, identify, and destroy a submerged submarine without ever having seen it. We, of course, never did. It was Cold War.
Mm-hmm. If you had done it, what would be the weapon you would have used?
It would depend upon what we had, of course.
And the circumstances.
but we had...
Did you have torpedoes that you could launch?
We had not only... We didn't ordinarily carry them. We had capability of carrying a nuclear depth charges, and nuclear torpedoes. We had that capability, but we did not carry them. They were wartime only. We were trained, we loaded them, but we never took off on missions with them like the James Bond movie Thunderball, where they took off and they had the gas the pilot and ditched it with the nuclear weapons on board. We never flew with nuclear weapons on board, but we had that capability.
How close do you think this country ever came to having the Cold War turned hot, besides the Cuban Missile Crisis we all know about?
I don't know. I had secret crypto clearance. I never had need for top secret. And I would imagine that most of that was at the top secret level, where only people like the Secretary of State might have had on her computer.
Mm-hmm. Or back then, his computer.
And back then, no computers.
Yeah, even better point. Do you think the world is safer now, or was it safer then when the adversary was the USSR?
I don't know. I know there were times when I was on midshipman cruises. This was back before I was an aviator and when I was in college. That there were times that we were on cruises. I was on my first midshipman cruise. I was aboard the Northampton, which was CLC-1, which is the command ship of the Second Fleet, and it was a converted Baltimore-class heavy cruiser, and the heavy cruiser in the Baltimore class had 8-inch guns, and
that's pretty big.
This one, they took the 8-inch guns off, added an extra deck to it, plus a 34-ton radar up in its superstructure, and 5-inch guns. And it tended to be a little bit on the top-heavy side, so it didn't have the righting moment of quickly being able to right itself from a rapid turn that most combatant ships have. But it was one that there were times that you felt that the war could have started at any time. And you have aboard ship from time to time drills, and you go to general quarters during drills. And on that midshipman cruise, my general quarters station was a compartment that was completely shut off. They shut off all the air conditioning. It was an air-conditioned ship. They shut off the air conditioning and even the ventilation. And there was no place to see outside, and it got hot and stuffy, and people got sick. A lot like D-Day. But the other time aboard ship, I was, back in those days, I was in the boiler room a great deal at the time. And it got up to about 130 degrees in the boiler room. And you'd sit under the blower to get that hot air blowing on you.
Well, a boy from Wisconsin like you, that's pretty hot, 130 degrees.
I was down to 178 pounds, and at
Wow.
6'3", that was pretty slim.
What do you think about flying saucers? Do you think they're real? Do you think we're being visited by extraterrestrials?
There are things they've, over the years, called flying saucers, many of which have been identified, some have not, but I don't have any particular expertise, but I do know that they.
Do you think we're alone?
That they're real.
Do you think we're alone?
Oh, in terms of anything extraterrestrial, I don't know. Don't know.
We just lost Stanton Friedman. He was probably the leading ufologist on the planet. I believe he was 84, and it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago he passed on. I believe you're familiar with Stanton Friedman, some of his work.
But I didn't have any direct association. And our mission was anti-submarine warfare, but the mission changed.
Everything overlaps in life.
And during Vietnam, there were times that we, for example, were flying surveillance for NASA launches, and we were particularly looking at certain areas where the various drop zones would be for the stages of the launch vehicle, where there would be a spot where the initial launch item would be dropped, and they didn't want to take a chance on it dropping on any ship.
That could be bad public relations.
That would be. It would be rather upsetting. Back, we checked the drop zones generally, gave them the information, gave NASA the information, and as we got closer into the launch time, they wanted specific information on specific points, specific ships, and where they were going and where they were going to be in 7 minutes, that sort of thing. And we provided that for them. When the P3s got over in the Pacific, backing up the forces on the ground in Vietnam and in the air and on the ground, they were doing surveillance, looking for ships, looking for downed aircraft, that sort of mission. So it wasn't just anti-submarine patrol. North Vietnam had no submarines of its own.
What was your favorite time in the Navy? I understand you were in Iceland. That must have been a pretty interesting experience.
Iceland was interesting, and it was surprising in some respects that Iceland is saying Leif Erikson discovered Iceland and also discovered Greenland and named them opposite in hopes that people would bypass Iceland and go to Greenland. And Iceland, I was surprised to find, had a great deal of green, primarily on the north part of Iceland.
Were you based in Iceland?
We were deployed to Iceland during the summers when the Russians were doing their fleet exercises in the North Sea. And that first year I was there, we were living in Quonset huts, which, of course, were left over from World War II. And
not a whole lot of insulation in them.
Didn't need a whole lot. We had heat, and that's you didn't need air conditioning. We had natural air conditioning.
Now, was Iceland a neutral country, or was it?
They were. As a matter of fact, when we were flying from Iceland, we were buying our fuel from Iceland, and Iceland was buying its fuel from the lowest bidder, which was the USSR.
Well, it's good everybody worked together.
So we were using Russian fuel to check on the Russian fleet exercises, helping their economy.
I like that.
Was that a no on the UFOs?
A long way around. He's obviously avoiding it.
He's very diplomatic.
He's seen an incredible UFO, and it's a secret.
They're so diplomatic. Is that part of the training? Secretive.
There were a lot of underwater things that we were told about, and sometimes we were called out on, and we located them, and we tracked them, and we identified them. Sometimes we couldn't identify them. And there were times that we were called out, and then we were called back. We don't want you surveilling that, which probably meant that it was a U.S. nuclear submarine that they had not identified as such before they launched us. Sort of like something I mentioned before we went on the air, the ADIZ, Aircraft Identification Zone, where they look to something shouldn't be there at that particular time.
What's the strangest thing you've ever seen?
In the Navy?
In the Navy, or you could even make it more general?
Could
be something
generals.
Underwater, above water.
We really are testing your memory today.
Yes.
Rapid fire.
I would have to give that more thought. It's a table topic that I guess I wouldn't have done well with today.
We should explain how we know Mike.
Well, I first met Mike, I guess it's been about a year and a half ago, in a Toastmaster group called Bradenton Toastmasters.
Oh, way to give out our location.
Mike is a long-time Toastmaster. How many years? What year did you first join?
I first joined in OshKosh, Wisconsin in January of 1971.
Wow.
And we moved to Maryland in September of 1973. And at that time, I was not aware of, they had no international directory that I was aware of. I was the treasurer of my club in OshKosh, Wisconsin, and it was a dinner club. And I was looking for Toastmasters out in Maryland, and I looked in the phone directories out there, and the closest thing they had to Toastmasters was Toast and Strawberries, which was baby clothes. But at the Civil Aeronautics Board, where I first worked when I went to the Washington, D.C., there was a woman who was in Toastmistresses.
Yes, because they didn't allow women in Toastmasters until 1975.
Well, allow is in quotes.
Yeah.
Because
what's the real story?
The real story is that the federal government would pay as training funds, from training funds, Toastmasters dues to the international and the local dues, and provide meeting rooms in government buildings or leased buildings. However, the group, whatever it may be, could not discriminate on the basis of sex and other things, and consequently, Toastmasters International had to, quote-unquote, catch up. But until they did, there were a number in Washington, D.C. that I'm familiar with who came in as E.J. Davis, for example. She was Evelyn Jane Davis, who later married Hugh Burgay and was E.J. Burgay. And she was later a district governor of the District 36, which covered the greater Washington, D.C. area.
So these are the first women in Toastmasters, but they came in more bulk in 1975. How do you think that changed Toastmasters? For the good or the bad?
Oh, absolutely for the good. We enlarged I think there are probably more women in Toastmasters than men these days.
Yeah, I think it's a majority.
I have a question. How did you find out about Toastmasters then? Was it a pretty well-known organization?
My first experience in being told about Toastmasters was when I was in flight training at Pensacola, Florida, when the lieutenant commander recommended Toastmasters to people there. But we didn't have an opportunity to do it at that time. And when I was flying operationally, I didn't have opportunity to track it down. And it was when I was an assistant district attorney in OshKosh, Wisconsin, that our chief investigator in the district attorney's office was a member of a Toastmasters club there in town.
How long were you assistant district attorney?
For just 1 year.
1 year.
And
do you have any homicide cases?
The homicide cases were handled by the district attorney. The cases I handled were burglaries, robberies, drunken driving, that sort of thing.
What's the strangest case you've been involved in? No names, just facts.
No, I remember some by name, but the strangest case I wouldn't discuss. But
must be a good one, huh, Bull?
Yeah.
All right, what's the second strangest case?
What are the strangest cases that I might discuss?
Okay, we'll settle for anyone.
And
or the most interesting, the most unique, the case that stands out the most. Pick a category.
There were various cases. Part of what we had was an opportunity as an assistant district attorney to have jury trials. And what would happen is oftentimes jury trials would get settled immediately before it went to trial. And the judges realized...
Especially if the guy was guilty.
Well, not only was the guy, and it was in most instances guys, guilty, but they saw that we had the necessary witnesses and the necessary documents to convict. And so they then were looking to enter a plea of guilty or in exchange for getting a bargain of a lower penalty than they would likely get from the penalty assessed by the judge following a jury trial guilty verdict, and you could have a jury trial or a trial to the court. But and for these cases, the defendant and the prosecution were entitled to have jury trials.
How accurate do you think the U.S. legal system is on the criminal side?
How what?
How accurate? Are guilty people found guilty and not guilty people found not guilty?
There's a lot would depend upon the quality of the prosecution and the defense. And the judges that you're before.
You're retired now. You can tell us the truth. How sharp are these judges?
Say again?
How sharp are the judges?
Oh, the judges.
You've got the attorneys. Some of the attorneys before them make many, many times what they make. Are they dedicated and that's why they're there, or are they not smart enough to have a tremendous successful law firm and make gazillions? Morgan and Morgan, in other words.
A little bit of insight from back in the dark ages when I was working in private practice. The attorneys would frequently forum shop, and there were certain judges that you wanted to be before in certain type of cases. And there were certain arguments that particular judge was known to be amenable to. And whether it was a male judge or a female judge. And then there were certain attorneys who could get that. So there were... For example, if you had a civil trial for damages and you had a personal injury case, there were certain attorneys that could get a higher judgment than other attorneys. So if you settled before trial, it sometimes would be 25% of the recovery that the attorney would take on a contingency basis. In other words, the plaintiff was the aggrieved person, the injured person, could go before a judge with a particular attorney, judge or jury, and get a lot more in a verdict than someone else, so that someone else who is less experienced and less able might get 25% of a $20,000 settlement, while the other attorney would get a $200,000 settlement, and he might get 33% of that, but 33% of $200,000 is a lot more than 25%.
Or from the client's perspective, 66% of $200,000 is way more than 75% of $20,000.
Absolutely. So having the right attorney and having him or her before the right judge.
Do attorneys really vary that much?
Yes.
Interesting.
But by the same token, attorneys who can't handle or don't handle that kind of trial work may find themselves more comfortable doing other things.
Well, isn't it a very small percentage of attorneys are trial attorneys? Somebody was telling me it's something like 1%.
You not only have trial attorneys, you have litigation attorneys. That there are some attorneys who are good at litigating settlements, and if they can't litigate the good settlement, then it goes to the trial attorney to actually try the case. But this isn't something that I've worked with to that extent. Most of my experience has been
Which do you think are fairer, jury trials or the judge being the jury?
Depends upon the case and depends upon the judge. If I mentioned before forum shopping, if you get before the judge and the right judge in a certain type of case, you may be able to feel from the beginning that you're going to get a favorable outcome. On the other hand, if you don't get that favorable judge because you have already used your challenge and been directed to another judge and the other judge is worse than the first one, then you want a jury trial and hope that the jury will come. You'll be able to argue to the jury something that you didn't feel comfortable arguing to the judge.
Mm-hmm. I think we beat that dead horse enough.
Well, I was going to ask, when you're hiring a lawyer, especially in the higher end lawyers, how much of what you're paying for is really just the relationships that they have and how, well connected they are, how much, how well they know the judge, how much of that is really a factor when you're dishing out a lot of money.
Well, that can be a significant factor. I remember back when I was prosecuting cases, there was a certain judge who drank his lunch. And I heard he was on the wagon. However, his on the wagon was he switched from gin martinis to vodka martinis. And would drink those at lunchtime, and if you hadn't wrapped up your jury trial before lunch with that particular judge, after his lunch, he would be amenable to having a motion from the defense counsel to dismiss for whatever reason because he was in no shape to continue the jury trial in the afternoon. And that judge was an elected judge and was defeated next time up.
Probably for the best.
How long had he been a judge before he was finally defeated?
He had, as I recall, it was 2-year terms, and I think he was a judge for about 6 years.
So about 3 terms.
His alcoholism caught up to him.
Yeah, interesting.
And he went on the outside, and he had been, before he became a judge, a very talented trial lawyer, but his alcoholism had done him in, and the people would try to refer cases to him, found that he was no longer a reliable trial attorney.
It seems to be a common, I don't know if it's a stereotype or not, but it seems like a lot of kind of jobs dealing with, kind of public service, like, maybe police officers or on the legal side of things, judges. It seems to be, again, it could be a stereotype, but there's an inclination to drink. I don't know if it's because eventually it's just like the monotonous, like you can never really fix the problem. It's just like a constant.
I think it's opportunity too. If you look at statistics, the people that abuse prescription drugs the most, professionals, are MDs because they simply have access to it.
Right.
Whatever we have access to. We are an interesting species, especially this country. This country per capita uses more prescription drugs, more recreational drugs than any other society in the history of the world.
It's because all you hippies.
Mike, were you a hippie?
I never was, and I was someone who never smoked a joint. Still am.
Going strong.
Back in your day, it wasn't legal. Now, over half the states have legalized medical, and I don't know, a half a dozen or so have legalized
recreational. Was
not
available.
only Colorado, but isn't it Nevada, California, Oregon, Washington?
I think Massachusetts just did it.
Massachusetts. I even think Rhode Island. So
Colorado is pushing for medical magic mushrooms.
Colorado has recreational.
Interesting.
But still not legally federal.
No.
Legal federally.
That's interesting. In the few minutes we've got left, I want to get back to aviation and talk about your future trip next month. You're going to OshKosh for which one is it, the 2019th?
That is correct. That's
which number is it the 50th anniversary or something?
Well, technically the 50th anniversary would be next year, which would be 50 years from the time they started, but this is the 50th time at OshKosh, Wisconsin. Starting in 1970.
How often do you go?
The last time I went was in 2013. And my mother died out in Wisconsin in December of 2012 at 99. And her birthday was in early August, and I could not go to Wisconsin in late July to visit her then, or she'd just say, he's out just for that air show, and he's just coming to see me because he's here. I had to go for her birthday.
You had to make a special trip.
Yes.
Okay.
So I went to 2013, but unfortunately, that was President Obama's opportunity to demonstrate the sequester and not have the Blue Angels or the Thunderbirds or any other federally funded group at the EAA fly-in. And not only that, but over the years, they've relied on volunteer air traffic controllers who are members. And that year, the president decided they should build the EAA, the $4 million or whatever that it took for all the air traffic controllers, even though they were volunteering their services. So it was, relatively speaking, disappointing. I've been there since then, much better, but I'm going again next month.
You're looking forward to next month's show?
Oh, absolutely. And my sister lives near there. And if it's runway 9 they're using, her barn is the point over which they fly and be aligned with runway 9.
What's the most interesting thing you've ever seen at the OshKosh Air Show?
A lot of things interesting. I flew right seat in a Ford Tri-Motor.
Wow.
That was...
What year was that built? 1927 something?
It was in the 1920s, and it felt like it could fly backward.
Is it this one?
It was so slow lifting off. It
With
could
3
lift
engines.
off at about 45 knots.
Wow.
This big boy right here?
Yeah, there it is.
And they have one at OshKosh.
I have that we can play the trailer.
That's Airventure.
I have some of the
2019
events pulled up. I don't know if any of these specific you're looking forward to. This
There's
is
the Ford Tri-Motor.
Bell helicopter rides.
Ford Tri-Motor flights. It's a full weekend, that's for sure.
No. They originally, when they had them, they started on a Saturday and they ran through the Sunday a week later. And one of the things that the EAA is proud of is they pick up everything. You won't find a gum wrapper there. Not that anybody chews gums these days, but you won't find a a napkin, or you might find a cigarette butt, but that probably would be field stripped. But they take pride in leaving everything at least as clean as they found it. And they even pay their parking tickets if they should have one.
Excellent.
You want to see what this says?
There was one year they had 12,500 aircraft there.
Jeez.
At either OshKosh or neighboring locations. And it was more than a tenth of the aircraft in the United States were there at OshKosh, Wisconsin.
Wow.
You want to see what this minute trailer looks like? Oops.
Sure. We'll see the trailer as we close.
Are we now off?
No.
I was gonna play this for anybody who's watching.
Oh, yeah.
More flash makes us more popular.
Those are the warbirds you just saw, and among other things, they had the T-28 there. That was the first aircraft that I carrier qualified in. That's
Whoa.
And there was one time there that I had flown out with Secretary Skinner, the Secretary of Transportation back then, and Jimmy Inhofe, who is now a senator from Oklahoma, and returned with Admiral Busey, who was then the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. And that was quite an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And back then, my dad was still living, and I took him to his SBD squadron reunion in Milwaukee.
Oh, wow.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mike Nolan. It has been a fascinating hour. Mike
Nolan,
definitely. Aviator, attorney,
extraordinaire,
Toastmaster.
I'm a
legend,
former
and boat
naval
captain.
aviator from back in the day.
Well, we'd always love to have him as a repeat guest. I appreciate you being our first
We're
guest.
expecting a good report on the OshKosh Air Show.
Oh, yeah, that'd be
Well,
awesome.
maybe so. I might remember something from the...
Might even have a
there.
picture or two of it.
Right.
Oh,
Sure.
maybe I'll even email you one. Or two.
Oh.
Excellent. And thank
you
you, ladies
again.
and gentlemen, for joining us today. Bull, another excellent show with an excellent guest. Thank you for all of your work.
Thank you. That was great.
And a special thank you to the podcast community for allowing us this time.
It's been real. See you next time.
Goodbye.
Boom.
Roy Rogers could say happy birthday.
Good job, Mike. Good job.